So this is Unit 1. We're going to talk about what UBD is and how it may be used in your classroom to kind of get you started. This is more of a general foundational area, so there may be areas that may seem a bit vague, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about that as we go forward. So the first question is, why a backward design format? Because that is the crux of UBD, is it is a backward design format. So let's look at planning a trip. When you plan a trip to go somewhere, what you do is you look at your final destination and then you plan each step on how to get there. Teaching should kind of be the same way, but unfortunately what we do is we kind of start at the beginning and just kind of randomly start walking around the lessons. We come up with, oh well, this activity sounds really good, this activity sounds good, and then we hope that it'll get us to an assessment, and we design our lessons first, then we design our assessment, and then at the end we kind of go back and say, well, why didn't they get it? Well, that's because we didn't design it the right way. We should start at the finish line, see what we want them to, what we want that unit to look like when it's done, and then work backward from there and figure out how to get them there. So, unfortunately, with traditional design, you're looking at a content design versus results design. Let me kind of explain that a little bit. When we just start with our lessons and we start thinking about ways to teach a subject, what we do is we look at the content. We take a look at what we want the content to be and what content we're trying to get, and usually we pull those from our standards, whether they be district standards or state standards or now even federal standards with the Common Core. What we should be looking at is a results design, and a results design is what backward design is all about. Results design, what we're doing there is we are taking what students should be able to do when they're done. And rather than looking at what we are going to teach them, we need to look at what they should be able to do. And that's the goal of the results-based design, which is what backward design focuses on. There are traditional design, which will be referred to throughout the course, and the first one is by hope and instead of by design. And what the authors basically mean there is when we start with our lessons, we think we've got a great job, but what we're really doing is we're hoping they're going to get everything in time for the test. Whereas when we actually design it backward, we're looking at where they should end up and then the steps backward to get them there, rather than we just kind of throw a bunch of content at the wall and do that. And you might say, well, I don't do that. I think we all do without even realizing it. What we do is we just take a whole bunch of little skills and we just hope it all kind of gels together at the end and they have a basic overall understanding. That's not the way it works. Students don't learn that way. We don't learn that way. It's kind of, I would compare it to a lot of professional development that some districts used to do. Hopefully they're not still, but in that that you have one little tidbit here, one little tidbit here, and one little tidbit here, a little workshop, a little full day event, and then by the end you're supposed to be a great teacher. They never really kind of pull everything together and say, how are you supposed to use these individual pieces? The other problem is coverage. When we talk about coverage, and we're going to hit this again later and throughout the course, is with coverage, we just have to get through it. We have to get through it. And what you're doing is when you have to get through it, you're really not getting through anything. Because as soon as you just get through it and you've taught it, it's not there. The students don't have it. It would be the exact same as showing you a picture of a 1,000-piece puzzle, let you look at it for about 30 seconds, and then saying, okay, now go put that puzzle together. You're probably not going to be able to do that. At least if you do, it's not going to be in a very efficient time frame. All of this is covered in pages 14 through 17 if you want more information. So let's talk about backward design then. There are 3 big stages to backward design. These are covered on pages 17 through 21. The 3 stages, the first step is to identify the desired results. We're actually going to spend the next several weeks talking about this because the least amount of paperwork and writing that you're going to do, but it is by far the most important part. Without that solid foundation, you can't learn. Your students will not learn. Think of it as a house. When you see a house go up, you see them spend more time on the foundation, and that foundation and that concrete sits for weeks and weeks before the rest of the house goes up. And then you see the rest of the house just kind of spring up from there. It's exactly the same way with backward design. You spend all the time on that foundation so that it's sturdy, so that you're sure that everything else can be piled on top of it. So that's the first step, is identifying those results. We're going to talk much more about understandings and essential questions as we go forward, but don't get too hung up on it right now. The second part is determining acceptable evidence. This goes to assessment. And I'm not just talking end of the unit assessment, here's your final test, yay, we're done. What I'm talking about is evidence throughout. You should be assessing your students every single day. And this leads me to a quick sidebar. One thing that we could be using assessment for is what we call homework. The unfortunate part is with homework, too often we sit there and we don't grade it for weeks at a time. We take it, we gather, we make sure they've turned it in. They might get it back 2 weeks later, a week later. That is not an efficient way of using homework. If that is the only way that you're using homework, it is completely pointless. Now, I'm not saying get rid of homework, but what I'm saying is you need to take anything that is determined to be evidence as a use of formative assessment and get it back right away. So if you are using a homework assignment as evidence of assessment, a formative assessment piece, you need to grade it right away so that you can see what students need, whether it's the whole class that needs a little bit more in one area, or individual students need a little bit of extra attention. That way you're not leaving them behind, so that when you get to the assessment at the end, they're completely clueless. We need to catch those students at the front until the back end and say, well, I don't know why they didn't get it, I taught it. And I'm sure you've probably heard colleagues say things like that. So that's the second stage of backward design. The third is planning those learning experiences in instruction. And this is where we usually start, but this is actually where it ends. So like I said, those 3 steps are described in pages 17 through 21 in a little bit more detail. Pages 22 through 28 have some excellent work done in there with a template that you can use if your district doesn't have a template, or if you're not teaching yet. There's an excellent template to make sure that you have all the pieces of UBD in it. You're not required to use it by any means whatsoever, but it is nice to kind of keep in the back of your mind for when you do the lesson planning piece. And then finally, there's a matrix on page 34 that kind of talks you through how to get through all those steps as we go forward. Again, you're not really filling any of that in at this point because we're just at those beginning phases. So now we talk about understanding. And again, I wish I had $1 throughout this course for every time we're going to say the word understanding, or you're going to hear the word understanding. I'd probably be able to retire right now. So some quick ideas of what understanding really is. In the first part, on pages 37 through 39, they talk about inferences. And a good example of understanding what inferences mean is if you give students a book to read, and you tell them, here's a dictionary, if you come across a word you don't know, look it up. That's a good practice. Unfortunately, students might be able to read an entire passage and know what every word in that passage means, but they may completely lose the meaning of the story. And I'm sure that you've probably seen students do that, where they can read everything aloud, they can pronounce everything perfectly, and they don't have a clue what the author's trying to say. This isn't just in reading class either. It could be math, science, or social studies. So there's a big difference between understanding what a word means and understanding the meaning of a passage or a skill set. So that's just transferability. This comes in with coaching. I'll give you my own example of transferability, and this kind of relates to everything. This is just one quick example. But I played baseball. I played football. I never in my life dreamed of playing hockey. One, I couldn't stay upright on skates very long, and two, I just didn't have the desire with all the other sports. So when my little brother started playing hockey, he needed a coach. Well, it was amazing to me, by my understanding of football, how much of those offensive and defensive schemes transferred really well to hockey. So I was able, because I understood the game of football so well, I didn't just know my position and know everything about it, I studied the game, and I was able to understand coaching schemes. I was able to transfer that to hockey. Now that could be done in many classrooms. We're talking about, for example, knowing multiplication. If you really understand what multiplication is, fractions are a lot easier. And that's just another quick example. But that's transferability. Now, understanding as a noun. This is another type of understanding. Driving a car is a great example of this. we can sit and read manual after manual after manual on how to drive, the rules of the road, and we can take the written test and pass it with flying colors. That does not mean we're going to be a good driver. Good drivers have to have experience doing it. Good drivers have to be behind the wheel and actually have to practice the actual act of driving a car to fully understand what they're doing. Again, there's the old phrase, it's like learning how to ride a bike, you never forget. That's because when you learn how to ride a bike, you do it by riding a bike. When you do it, you understand it. And therefore, when you understand something, it stays with you. So that's when we talk about that. When you ever hear people use that phrase, that's what they're talking about. And then a great section, which I highly recommend you go back and read, even though I'm going to talk about it, is the expert blind. The expert blind spot means is that there are many times when we take something for granted that it's easy, but our students don't. So we have a blind spot to it. I'll give you a prime example. Math facts. My goodness, math facts. Many times we sit there as elementary teachers, or even middle school or high school teachers. This is not exclusive to the elementary level. We look at the multiplication facts and say, gosh, why don't they get this? We've done it every year. This is so simple. The problem is we've never taught them what multiplication means. We just give them a list of facts and say, memorize this. Well, they don't understand what it means, so they can't transfer it to 2-digit times 2-digit multiplication, or they can't use it in chemistry much later when they're trying to figure out atomic weights, or they're trying to figure out different ways of using multiplication within that skill set. They don't understand how it applies and how it works. Therefore, they never quite get the pieces. So what I'm trying to basically say here is that the expert blind spot, we take things for granted that students should just get, and they just don't. So that's it. Like I said, I would highly recommend you go back and read that area. So let's talk about evidence of understanding. Again, I'm going to briefly recap with this section, but it's much different than our standards. We take a look at our standards, and for a long time, what we have done as part of the standards movement, which we're going to talk more about later, is that we just take it for granted that that's what we need to teach. We take a look at this list and we say, that's what we need to teach. Unfortunately, these are not deep skills. These are individual kind of skills that are very piecemeal. I would let's go back to the car example. If I take a look at the underneath hood of a car and I take that car apart, I've got thousands of different pieces of a car. Well, you can sit there and you can tell me what each piece does, and you can tell me how each piece works, but I can't put that car back together again. There's no talk about evidence of understanding. We need to start putting these pieces together for our students and for the people that we're trying to teach, because we're not doing that right now. So there's not a whole lot of evidence of that understanding. So we need to look at how do we know that they understand versus how do we know that they're able to perform a skill, which is really what we're looking at many times right now, is we're looking at individual skills rather than that overall understanding. So then there's a great section on understanding misunderstanding and why that is so important. I'm going to give you a quick example from one of my students. I had a student when we were doing, when I taught 5th grade, we were doing math, and this student could not get a 2-digit times 2-digit multiplication problem correct. And I sat there and I quizzed him on his math facts, and boy, he knew his multiplication basic facts, just thick and through and through, and he knew it. And then he would sit there and he would go do one, and until I actually watched him do a multiplication problem, I didn't know what he was doing. Once I watched him do it, I saw exactly what he was doing wrong and why. What he was basically doing is he was taking the ones digit on one number and times the ones digit on the bottom number, which is exactly what you're supposed to do. Like, for example, 37 times 47, he was taking 7 times 7, he was getting 49. The problem was he was writing the 4 at the bottom of his problem, carrying the 9, which is the inverse of what he should have done. The reason he was doing it is because when I was giving examples and I was showing them, I would say, you would take 7 times 7, that's 49, and I would, instead of saying 49 and writing the 4 in 49 first, I was writing the 9 at the bottom, so I was writing the numbers in the exact opposite way that I was saying them. Well, he was listening, he was an auditory learner, and he was getting it backwards. So just by that little misunderstanding and watching his misunderstanding, that misunderstanding, I was able to change my teaching method to where I never made that mistake again, and I never saw that problem in my classroom again. That's one minor example from my own experience, but there's a lot in there that we can learn about misunderstanding. It's very important that we don't just try to correct the misunderstandings, but we figure out why they are misunderstanding things. This was a huge thing that I learned when I went through Understanding by Design. So now let's talk about the standards movement. This was fascinating to me. We're on pages 60 through 62 if you want to know more. But Marzano and Kendall did some fabulous work. They looked at a basic curriculum, K through 12, and they found 255 content standards. So basically, every time that there is something in the content that this student must know by the time they get through this grade level, blah, 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 blah. And through that, they found 3,968 benchmarks. Now, when you say, well, that's 13 years, that's kindergarten through 12th grade, that's 13 years. Yeah, I should be able to get through that. So what they looked at is they said, well, let's say you spend 30 minutes per benchmark. That's it. I think we would find that to be ridiculous to only spend 30 minutes to get through one benchmark. But if we just did that, we would need 15,465 more hours than what we currently have, which if you keep that in the context of a 6.5 hour, 7 hour school day, you would need an additional 9 years to teach all of that content. So that's the first problem with the standards movement, is what teachers have been saying for years. There's too much content to teach. So that's one of the problems with it. The other problem with the standards movement is that it's too vague. You hear students should understand the movement of the universe. Well, that's so vague. What exactly should they be able to do? So whereas teachers, myself included, have questioned that for decades, what we need to do is we need to actually unpack those standards and figure out what is it we're trying to do here, what is it we're trying to accomplish, and how can we put them all together so that we've got a unit where there are multiple benchmarks being taught at the same time, multiple content standards, to where we're not trying to isolate these skills anymore, because that is detrimental to our teaching and to our students' learning. So on page 64, they come up with there's a great table there. They talk about how to unpack standards. They talk about taking those goals and breaking them down into where you can come up with some essential questions and some understandings and things like that. Now, when you look at page 64 right now, you're going to see those essential questions, you're going to see those understandings, and you're probably going to not quite get how to do that yet. That's okay. We're going to do that down the road. For right now, don't worry about that. Just kind of take a look at page 64 and kind of see exactly how they take one of those big standards, one of those big goals that we don't know how we're going to get through all those goals throughout the year, and we kind of just take a look at some of those things. Then we start talking about big ideas and core tasks, and this is for the rest of the third chapter. And what we're basically talking about with big ideas and core tasks, we're talking about those overarching things that we need to be able to make sure students understand. I think we all know that students are never going to walk out of our classrooms and remember every single thing we did every single day throughout the entire school year. But we need to identify what are those major core things that they have to be able to do, those big ideas, and which translate into those core tasks. And that's kind of the point of understanding what the big ideas and core tasks are. Now, page 71, there's a great graph there to kind of talk to you, that kind of talks through this a little bit more and in a much better way than I'm able to do now. But they start off, you identify those big ideas and core tasks, those things they have to be able to understand and be able to walk out of your classroom knowing. And then you build on those important things that are important, not essential, but are important, and that students should have a general understanding of when they walk out of your classroom. And then on top of that, there's some things that they're worth being familiar with. They should just have a basic idea of, and if it comes up down the road, they should say, oh yeah, we talked about that before. So what you need to do is identify that, break that down, so that your students so you're able to know what to focus on with your students. The next big section is on the teacher's new clothes. This is a little bit in relation to the expert blind spot, but it's a little different. What we do many times is we say that if you remember the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, he thought he saw them, but nobody else could see them, so he looked naked. We do the same thing to our students all the time. When we say, you should understand that this is a pretty easy concept. This is something that, that is not too hard to grasp. Well, think of it this way. We have all these abstract ideas that are very obvious to us. One that comes to mind with me is gravity. It's a very absolutely concrete idea because we see things on the ground. To students, gravity is an abstract concept. They don't understand that there's this force because you can't see force. You feel force, but you can't see it. I used to always ask my students that about gravity. I said, how do you know gravity's pulling on you? Well, you don't, because you've been feeling it since you were born. So you've kind of gotten used to it. They don't understand that. But there are a couple others that they talk about in the book as well. And that is, like, we talk about the Earth is constantly spinning. Well, to young students, when we teach this the first time, that's a very abstract idea because they'll think, why aren't we dizzy? If we're spinning around all the time, we should be busy. When we talk about slavery and social studies, the idea of having a person own another person is a very abstract idea because we don't have that in our society anymore. Very housekeepers that are not slaves but are paid to do the work that slaves used to do, those are very abstract ideas because they don't see it. When you talk about Hamlet, Hamlet is a very, very relatable play if you make it concrete versus abstract. It's the same story we talk about all the time with teenage angst and depression and things like that. But kids don't see it that way unless we break it down for them. So rather than have these abstract ideas, we need to figure out how to make them real. And then there are some great misconception alerts that I highly recommend that you go back and or read on your own. One of those is and these misconception alerts, whenever they appear, definitely read them. But one that really stuck out to me was when we talk about teachers that say, I focus on my skills, so there aren't any big ideas. Well, if all you're doing is focusing on skills, you're not going to get any kind of understanding whatsoever. It's like I said with the car before, you have all these bits and pieces, but you never bring it all together. So that is essential to understanding. If we can't figure out how everything fits in a greater scheme, then we aren't doing our jobs. So that's a little bit about unpacking those standards. So to kind of wrap up, one thing I want to make very clear is that this little lecture piece right here does not substitute reading the book, okay? So if there were areas that seemed a little vague, I highly recommend you go through all 3 chapters, skimming a little bit, making sure that you hit any high points, but definitely if any of the parts I talked about seem vague at all, I highly recommend you go back and read through them. You definitely don't need to focus on reading all 80 plus pages in depth and really focusing and studying, but you do need to kind of make sure you zone in on the areas that were a little more abstract to you. So hopefully that helped. Now, what is UBD in a nutshell? Well, that's probably not best coming from me. That's probably best coming from the author himself. So let's take a listen.
All right, I'm going to begin with a brief look at the big ideas of UBD. Some of you are familiar with this, but not everyone. And it's an underscore point for this session. The 2 big ideas in Understanding by Design are suggested in its title. The first, we propose that the best, most effective teaching occurs when our focus is helping students understand the content being taught. Well, you might say, well, duh. Yes, doesn't every teacher want his or her students to understand what they teach? Perhaps, but the devil's in the details. A focus on understanding raises an immediate question. What's worth understanding in all that we teach? Because everyone in this room who's been a teacher understands a quintessential problem, and it's one from pre-K to university. Every teacher I know faces it, and we all know what it is. We have too much content and not enough time to teach it all. This is a quintessential challenge in teaching. How do we address this problem? Well, we could talk faster in class and get through more material, But it's not about covering material, it's about learning. And so the question raised by a focus on understanding is, what are the most important things that are most worth understanding in all that we teach? And how do we identify the big ideas, the transferable processes, the content that has the greatest intellectual meat? And we propose that that is part of our planning as well as our teaching.